Women of Wyoming Then and Now is brought to you by the Wyoming Historical Society and supported in part by a grant from the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, a program of the Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources. This program features unique female perspectives on events, themes, or narratives related to state history. We, the host, believe that one woman's action toward a better future can result in a greater legacy that inspires and equips many generations of women to come.
Hello, my name is Sylvia Bruner, today's host for Women of Wyoming. And I am excited to be here today with Sue Myers, retired journalist and history advocate, longtime Johnson County resident, and Janelle Molony, project director of the Women of Wyoming and also the oral history chair of the Wyoming State Historical Society.
Thank you so much for having us today. And Sue, welcome. I look forward to hearing your stories.
Can you tell us about something that you have done that you think is going to impact the future perspectives on Wyoming history, and maybe even especially for women and their place in Wyoming history?
History's in every family, and it's important that somebody, and it's usually going to be a woman, because they have the empathy and the interest of knowing what it was like back in the early 1800s or 1900s. Once the history event is over with, or it's gone, if you don't have it documented in some way. And I guess that's probably the most important thing to me. I've done multiple interviews and helped other people document their histories for probably 40 years or more. And I hope that reading some of these, that other people will be inspired to document their history.
How many people have you interviewed before?
I don't know. I worked in a newspaper for a long time, and I did feature stories on people, so I suppose probably 100, 150.
That's a lot, Sue.
The thing that I tried to do with the interviews and the stories and is capture the personality, capture the feeling. If I can make the reader feel or have empathy for the person that I'm interviewing, then I've completed my job, because that's what I want to do. Not just the facts, but I want to do the personalities, the feelings that go along with it.
I think that's a really key point. Not just that history is in every family, but that quite often the personal history is recorded by women. And I think you nailed that as far as that interest and empathy, because, you know, in my limited experience of research in this area, frontier military, for instance, the men tended to record the logistics, maybe of a wagon train, but they weren't necessarily recording the hardships or the losses, the feelings that people experienced. So you got that right for sure.
I agree with all of those statements. I see it in curriculum. I see it in the published texts that we have, even the curated exhibits in museums. You can tell almost something's missing. So much more that goes into it. You're not telling a story of what they did. You're really capturing who they are and representing that in a nutshell, which is tricky.
How did you get into that? What was your background or context that gave you that interest, and what I would say became a bit of a passion for capturing those stories?
I'm glad you asked that. Thelma Gatchell Condit is probably one of the well-known historians, Wyoming historians, and has documents in the archives and all. And she was my 8th grade teacher, as well as somebody that we'd known in the family for a long time. But when we started studying Wyoming history, she had mentioned to me that my grandmother's stepfather was Jack Flagg. And then she proceeded to tell me the part that he played in the Johnson County Cattle War. Well, that just got me intrigued about, well, I've got a relative that was important. So that started it. Then I in high school, I didn't really do anything. But then when I went to work for the Bulletin in 1966, I was the historian pretty much that worked for the paper.
Did you pull on the thread to learn about Jack Flagg?
Oh, yes. Yes, he had a paper that told all about his part, or the Johnson County Cattle Wars called, I forgot.
The Voice, wasn't it?
No, the name of the pamphlet, the story, Johnson County Cattle War. Anyway, it was a newspaper series that he wrote right after the Johnson County Cattle War, which was probably surely one-sided, but also it was written right after, so the facts were there early. And so I started looking into his background, but in the meantime, that was just part of my job as a newspaper, was to interview, do feature stories. After I left the Bulletin, I was there for 26 years, I think, I did freelance writing and helped a lot of people with books that they were writing. I never did my books that I was writing ever finished, but I sure helped a lot of other people.
You've been quite instrumental in a number of publications beyond books too. The quarterly at the museum, I mean, you spearheaded and ran that and kept us on task as much as possible.
I do about anything. If somebody mentions that it will be historic, that it's something that's going to be saved. And I think I've done that pretty well. I think anybody can do that if they keep their ears open and listen for that one sentence somebody says that, oh yeah, I remember my granddaddy had her still out behind the barn. Click. Let's talk about that more. It's fun. It's fun to find those places, those clicks.
So I have a question for you about writing on other people's legacies or other people's histories. When you're approaching someone else's history, perhaps sometimes you feel that passion and that fire and you're excited to tell that story, but they maybe don't have that same passion. First, you have to look into their background just a little bit so that you know kind of the buttons to push to get their confidence. And I always tell them, this is probably not journalistic, but I always say, I'm going to write this and I'm going to tell your story. But when I'm through, you can read what I finished product. You can't change what I've written, but you can change correct if it's not right, because that's important that they do it. I always quote my dad, who said history is only the way that one person remembers it. So you have to work that into that too. If it's a controversial thing or something you're not sure of, I usually try to find two other sources before I put it on there to verify it if it's something that I question. But mostly, I guess you can stress the importance of their stories to their next generations. They will have the history of your family and maybe learn from it. And it might not even be our family, Sue. Sometimes the stories that we put together actually invite the interest of other people that we didn't even think would be super interested in.
Did you find that sometimes you just had to maybe break through a shell of modesty that people have? Because I see sometimes when I'm asking for family histories and information that people think, well, it's just my family. We didn't do anything that important, but they probably did. And when you're interviewing people like that, to get them to recognize that you think their history is important. I guess I try to do that before I ever start the interview, to have them realize why I'm doing it. And mostly I just say, because if I don't do it, it's lost. I mean, the fact that your grandmother started the first post office in Mayworth, and it's not down on paper someplace, that's going to be lost. Right. So how do you hope that your contributions are going to be utilized or recognized in the future? My important thing is that the history is there, that they can look it up, that they can find it someplace, that it's available.
don't have well, I guess when I worked for the Bulletin and did some of the historic work for the paper, my name's not out there. But a lot of the state things, my name's not even there. It doesn't really make any difference.
So you have, sounds like, had a long time goal of true preservation.
Yeah.
You're capturing, you're preserving, you're keeping that.
That's what I think is so important, because once it's gone, and it's gone, and you can't go back and look for it if it's not documented someplace.
So what is the type of story that really excites you?
Personal histories, experiences. I've written a lot about people that grew up or had married or in the late 1800s, early 1900s, their lives. For example, my grandmother was 12 years old when the incident with Jack Flagg at the
The KC Ranch.
Yeah, the KC Ranch.
You know what, Sue, let's go back a step. Can you tell us more about your family's experience or knowledge on Jack Flagg and the Johnson County Cattle Wars and KC Ranch? So can you tell us that story?
Jack Flagg married my grandmother's great-grandmother. She had 5 kids, and then they had 4 more between the 2 of them. Well, I don't think that there was just the 5 kids that were out there at Barnum when they were living out there. And Alonzo, Grandma's brother, was 14, I believe, at the time, and he was driving a wagon. And Jack Flagg was actually on the way to the state Democratic convention in Douglas and was going to Buffalo to meet another party, I think, that was going down there. So he was riding horseback, and Alonzo was in the wagon, and as they came down to the KC Ranch, the invaders were already there and had surrounded the cabin that Nick Ray and Nate Champion were in. And Jack Flagg was on the list to be killed. That the invaders had this list. But they didn't recognize him when he started coming down the road until he got one of them that was in the barn shooting at the cabin, recognized him, and they said something to the effect, "Get that guy." And Jack Flagg realized what was going on at the time too, so he grabbed his rifle. They did not know it, but he only had 3 bullets that were in the rifle, and Alonzo didn't have a gun. Anyway, so they beat the horses, they whipped the horses and got up, and then Jack Flagg reached down and cut the reins that were going to the horses that were pulling the wagon, and then got on one of those horses, got Alonzo on one of those horses so they could, and they did get all the way through. They were fired at, but neither one of them were hit. And he was given credit for carrying the message of the invasion of the invaders to Buffalo. However, there was a neighbor that was, I forgot his name, that was there that had had gotten the word out too. So he probably wasn't the one that did it, but he got to Buffalo and was at the TA Ranch when they were the final episode of the war.
So you mentioned after that he wrote down his memories initially.
And they lived on a ranch clear up at the end of in Barnum, up there on the red wall. And they left. Jack Flagg and Grandma's mother left those kids alone, and there was 4 of them, I think. And Grandma told about making bread and putting it down on a bench so that they could knead it and cook. And then one time, one of her brothers got treed by a bear, and they had those type of stories that are probably just individual to that particular family, but representative of some of the other families that were in the area too. And I think I just mumbled that story up. He bought the paper. He never went back to the ranch.
What year was that he ran away and started the paper?
So that would have been 1892. He never went back to the ranch. I don't know that Alonzo ever did. He sent somebody, a young man, boy, they said, out to the ranch to bring Grandma and the other kids into Buffalo, but he never went back. He bought a newspaper, and the first thing he did was write his series on his take on the Johnson County war. And it's biased, but it's colorful.
Mm-hmm.
It's all a first person account,
Yeah.
so you can't help but be biased when you're writing what only you have seen and experienced.
I think that was a tremendous piece of history that he got down right after it happened. He also, and I don't know if you've ever read it or not, but he also talks about what the country was like. It's not just his political take on everything, but you could kind of feel that when you read it, you can kind of feel the atmosphere, the tensions, and it was good. That was the one thing that I'm very proud of, is that got published and wasn't destroyed.
How did Grandma end up perpetuating the family stories and making sure that grandkids, such as you, would know and be able to access those resources? How was she setting the example for keeping this relevant?
She never really talked about it. You didn't then. People in Buffalo didn't talk about it. There was two sides, and they didn't want to have that conflict. She told me that Nick Champion was a good friend of theirs, and he stopped by. She remembers him saying most of the time they weren't allowed in the rooms when the dyados were, they were shuffled off someplace else. But she remembered hearing Nate say, "They're going to get me, Jack." And maybe there was more to it. I don't remember. It's written down someplace.
How are you passing this passion down to the next person in your family, Sue?
That's a good question, because I don't believe I really have. I'm sorry about that. I think my kids now, the ones that are grown and stuff, have started going back and looking at some of the things that I've written.
So you haven't lost it. You've preserved it for when they're ready to have that interest.
Yeah.
And that's, history isn't always the biggest topic enjoyed by young people. I think that's safe to say, right? Because it seems to be human nature. We become more interested the older we get, and then we always hear so often that people have regrets that they didn't pay attention to their grandmother or whomever when they were younger. So the work that you've done in this preservation, it's there. So I wouldn't say you've lost it. I think it's there for them. Yeah.
Do you think it's important to have that conversation with children and grandchildren to figure out what's going to happen next? This work that I've done, these items that I've preserved, will you be able to take care of them?
I think it's important. I'm sorry I haven't done it.
What advice would you give to a future researcher who runs into a situation where the subject that they're looking into or the content is something that wasn't talked about for whatever reason? Maybe something that was perhaps protected because it's embarrassing to the family, or maybe it's criminal activities or suspicions around their family that, or maybe socially, the thing that is important historically, they feel like socially that's not an acceptable topic to even document or talk about.
How do you broach that with them?
I probably simply just ask them, are you comfortable talking about that? Anytime that you're a writer and you're going to be working with people, the first thing you have to get to do is know how to make them feel comfortable. And maybe is talking about their something completely off the subject that you're really going to, but they have to get to be comfortable with you, that they can trust you.
Nowadays, because of the research we can do and the documents we can access, we can figure out some of those more difficult topics. We have proof, that maybe in the past people tried to keep under wraps, but too bad, it's now out in the open. So thank you for your comments on how to approach that in a responsible way. Facts are not always the full story. That empirical evidence, that document alone is not the full story. So it's important to make sure you hear from the people, their preference for how to remember that person.
I've learned a lot from you, and I've also learned to really value what I see as like your integrity when you're approaching something. You have a value for that accuracy, but also the human touch. And I think those things can go together. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And that's definitely something that I have learned from you.
Well, ladies, Sylvia and Sue, that is all the time that we have for today's interview, but we are certain there is much more to be learned when we take a look back and from Sue's experiences that we can incorporate into our own research and our own thoughtful approaches to collecting history. So we are delighted that we had an opportunity today to pass this information along to others who may have questions or want to look further into their own personal life, or as you do as a journalist, maybe to preserve the stories of others that are local or regional. So as a starting point for our listeners, we will include a few follow-up links with the video. Thank you everyone for joining us today for Women of Wyoming Then and Now.
Thank you.
Thank you.